He joins me on the wall now. Mr. Wechi, let's begin with conversations around Hezbollah's legitimacy as a military target in this conflict. Is it clear whether its dual role as a political party and a militant group affects its legitimacy as a military target under international law, particularly in the context of Israel's recent strikes?
Well, what you see is clearly what may best be described as a solidarity offensive by neighboring countries within the Middle East who share the sympathy with Palestine, as it were. When you interpret the narratives, the diatribes from the Hezbollah group, stating that their action is in retaliation of the Israelis' offensive in Lebanon, and particularly the attacks against the Hamas group, as it were, in the restoration of the Palestinian state, you'll see that there is a strong tie between these armed groups within the region. It's not necessarily a question of legitimacy per se. It's an indication of a rising tide of regional, full-scale regional conflict within that axis against Israeli stance. And you know that the recent attacks came as a result of the launch against the northern border of Israel. And Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed and used the words that he will do everything possible to restore security within his country, and particularly the northern border. So Israel is faced with an increasing number of resistance groups, such as the Islamic resistance in Iraq, as well as Hezbollah, and then Hamas on the other side.
All right.
So these various tranches are railroading the entire conflict into a full-scale regional war, and lives are being lost in countless tones. You have 182 people who have just died this morning, going by the statistics published by the Lebanese Health Ministry, and about 700 previously wounded.
Indeed.
So it goes to the question, what indeed do these warring parties want? What has generated the interest of these other groups on a conflict that is mainly between Israel and Palestine?
Talking about, Mr. Wechi, talking about loss of lives, Israel is now asking civilians to evacuate target areas across the border. How do international humanitarian laws, such as the Geneva Conventions, govern evacuation of civilians from conflict zones? And what obligations do you think both Israel and Hezbollah have in this regard in protecting civilian populations?
Well, as for Israel, Israel has an obligation under international law, Geneva Convention, to ensure that civilian targets are not hit. The targets that must be of the essence here has to do with the military infrastructure. Hezbollah may not necessarily be bound by those laws by way of being referred to as a terrorist organization. So you cannot be binding laws on such organizations that are already referred to by some international organizations as lawless or terrorist groups. So how do you regulate terrorism or terrorists by law rather than bringing them to justice? So that is the reason why Israel's attack on those targets cannot necessarily be justified. Yes, it has sent out red alerts for civilians to evacuate those neighborhoods and houses both in and next to these suspected target areas that are used to house weapons, as they say. But Israel also owes a duty to go the extra mile to ensure the full evacuation of these civilians. There is no justification for attacks even if civilians are being used as shields by these terrorist so-called organizations, Israel still owes a duty, because the innocent ones must not become victims of this war by foreseeable attacks, by
Mr.
foreseeable
Wechi,
consequences.
It sounds like it is the same reason Israel is given, that it has the obligation to protect its own civilian population. And the issue of proportionality of response has been, a bone of contention, especially at the back of the conflict in Gaza. What criteria really determine the proportionality of Israel's military response to Hezbollah's attacks in this regard?
You have used the word obligation. That obligation now means that the states, the affected states, owe a duty of working together to protect human lives. That is to say, both Lebanon, Iran, and Palestine, assuming you have to bring them into this picture, the state actors must collaborate at some point. There must be a connectivity between the Israel government and the Lebanese government to protect the the civilian population. Now, if that synergy, no matter the conflict between them, is not established, the terrorist organization or the armed group, as it were, will capitalize on it to expose civilians to Israeli attacks. And to be very fair, much as Israel is trying to protect its own interest and its own territory, there is a limit to which Israel can enforce that obligation without the imprimatur of the state, because there is a state actor in Lebanon in this case, which is the Lebanese government, as well as the non-state actors, which has to do with the Hezbollah.
Indeed. Because
the Hezbollahs cannot be referred to as state actors. So there should be some measure of collaboration going in the spirit of statesmanship and in the spirit of humanity, like you rightly pointed out, under humanitarian laws, between both actors. Because no matter the level of grievance between the warring parties, they both owe the obligation to ensure that civilian populations are protected, no matter the level of aggression between the warring parties. So they must find a way to communicate and synergize. If not, Israel may not necessarily solely be blamed where it has exhausted or employed the proviso of reaching out to the other party on the other side, because
I hear you clearly.
That both sides are armed, and this civilian population is not armed. So they cannot be used as guinea pigs or needless casualties of this conflict to justify the attacks between the both sides.
There's a rich historical antecedent here where you consider the long-standing conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, including the 2006 Lebanon war. I guess we'll see how these play out and how the international community also will intervene in the coming days. But that's our time. International law expert Livingston Wechi, thank you for your thoughts